Welcome to Daily Dose of Aramaic. This is lesson 4 in our grammar lessons. We've been talking about prepositions, and now we're in part 2 after having discussed prepositions in terms of comparison, time, and location. Now we're moving on to what might be less obvious conceptually, but still is important for Aramaic grammar, and that is the use of prepositions as object markers and in agent phrases. You can find more information on this topic in several places in Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters, pages 24 to 27, 65, and 104 to 107. I chose a different organizational arrangement of these concepts, putting them together instead of separately. We will see them again. All right, so to talk about objects, first I should mention and then set aside for the moment the linguistic concept of valency. Valency describes the number of participants in a verbal action. And objects participate in a verbal action by receiving the verbal action in the case of direct objects, or as receiving some sort of benefit from the receipt of a verbal action, and that's the indirect object idea. For this lesson, we're going to stick with the traditional grammar terms indirect and direct object and the use of prepositions to mark them. Let's look at Daniel 2:16, this slice of it. An appointed time he will give to him. We notice that the subject is present in the imperfect verb there. It's the imperfect third person masculine singular. We know this from the yod prefix. Appointed and appointed time. This is the direct object of the verb. It doesn't have to come before the verb. It's not mandated by word order rules or anything like that, but we can see from context that that is the direct object. And then to him. Him. He is the one who receives the benefit of the appointed time. I guess there's an appointment that has been made, and somebody is going to receive that appointment. That's the idea of to him in Daniel 2:16. And we know that it's to him through use of the third person masculine singular suffix pronoun there with the tsere and the he with the mapik inside. Okay, so that having been said, what marks that indirect object? That lamed, which is reflected in English with the word to. And this is a very frequent use of lamed in Biblical Aramaic, and also we remember it from Hebrew. But let's look at Daniel 6:12. And they found Daniel. The receiver of that finding action is Daniel. He is the direct object, not the indirect object, and the lamed marks Daniel. This is an infrequent phenomenon in Biblical Hebrew, but frequent in Biblical Aramaic. Lamed acting as a direct object marker. Now, a person could ask, how would one know the difference between lamed use as indirect object marker and direct object marker? And that, of course, would have to be discerned through contextual considerations. Now, there is a direct object marker separate from lamed in Biblical Aramaic. It's yat. And this stands in the same role as the frequently seen Biblical Hebrew direct object marker, et or et. The only thing is, it only appears once in the limited Biblical Aramaic corpus in Daniel 3:12, so it's helpful to know about, but actually lamed marks the direct object far more often than the designated direct object marker, yat. Yat serves this function much more in extra-biblical writings. Now, all of this is to say, marking of the direct object is not obligatory in Biblical Aramaic. So in Daniel 2:13, and they sought Daniel and his companions. Well, there's no mark here. The first word is the verb, and then you have those whom they sought, Daniel and his companions, without there being some sort of special mark of the direct object. So what have we talked about so far regarding object marking? Lamed is a frequent object marker, both for the indirect and direct object. It's not required. And in marking the direct object, lamed is actually doing something for which there is a yat word, but yat only appears once. Now, there's another use of prepositions that should be mentioned. Not that it is extremely frequent, but this shouldn't throw us off when we encounter it. So agent phrases designate an agent, and they're necessary in the case of needing to designate the agent that's involved with a passive voice expressed verbal action. It's not necessary to have an agent phrase with active voice expressions because the subject is the agent. But in passive voice expressions, the agent is not even necessary to designate. The man was hit. We don't know who did the hitting in that case. But if the author wants to designate the agent, the means in Biblical Aramaic, as in most languages of the world that have agent phrases in passive voice expressions, is the use of a preposition. So here's an example in Daniel 2:34. A stone was cut not by hands. And this by thought right here, it goes along with the use of bait that we've seen before, in or with, using English glosses. We haven't really talked about bait in an instrumental sense, like how one uses one's hands, okay? But the thing here is there's a thin line between the instrumental use of a preposition like bait and its use as an agent of a passive voice expression. But the fact that the use of a preposition to mark the agent in such situations is not limited to bait helps us to see that this is not necessarily an instrumental use of bait, but instead is designating the agent. So hands being the prospective agents behind the cutting. They're not here, but that's because of the negative particle. Now, what do I mean by other prepositions? Well, again, the Biblical Aramaic corpus is limited, but actually min can serve as an agent marker, as we see right here, until from me, no, until a decree is made by me. A passive voice expression where min is serving as the agent designator in Ezra 4:21. So what have we seen in this short lesson? The use of prepositions as object markers, although non-obligatory in the case of the direct object, as well as prepositions used in agent phrases. So later, when we talk about passive voice, we shouldn't be surprised for that use of prepositions to show up again, but now we've seen them in our unified approach to prepositions. I look forward to studying Lesson 5 with you next.